In this lesson, we are going to combine the last two events that must take place before the start of the 7-year tribulation, the building of the third Jewish temple, and the signing of the peace covenant. In my opinion, these two events have a clear cause and effect relationship. Let's start with the building of the third temple. The two primary passages that prophesy the Jewish third temple will be built are these. Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, "And he," that is the Antichrist, "shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week, and for half of the week he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering." In this passage, 1 week is 7 years, which represents the 7-year tribulation. It begins with a perceivable, unbreakable 7-year peace covenant that is signed between the Antichrist and many nations, including Israel, that would have interest in restoring peace to the Middle East. The nations are not listed in Scripture. Halfway through the 7-year agreement, this passage indicates that the Antichrist breaks the covenant, forcefully enters the Jews' temple, stops the ongoing Jewish sacrifices and offerings, and makes his own sacrifice that is so despicable that it makes the temple unholy and unusable by the Jews. For this to happen, the third Jewish temple must be built and fully operational within the first 42 months of the tribulation. The second passage is 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 4. He, again the Antichrist, opposes and exalts himself against every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God. As Paul is describing a few of the events in the tribulation to the new Christians in Thessalonica to assure them that they are not already in the tribulation, he explains that one of the biggest events in the tribulation is when the Antichrist denounces all other religions and gods, including Christianity and Judaism, enters the temple of God, referring to the Jewish temple, and proclaims himself to be God. We know from Daniel that this takes place in the middle of the 7-year tribulation, which further reinforces the fact that the Jewish temple will be fully operational by then. There is a third passage as well in Matthew chapter 24:15 where Jesus reiterates Daniel's prophecy. Now that we have established that the temple will, in fact, be built, where do they build it, and how long will it take, and when do they build it? Let's start with where it will likely be built. The Bible does not say the exact location, but we know from historical documentation that the previous 2 Jewish temples and the future temple in the 1,000-year Messianic kingdom after the tribulation were and will be built in the same geographic location, which is the old city of Jerusalem on what is commonly known as the Temple Mount. There is no reason to think that Israel will agree to build the third temple anywhere but on that Temple Mount. The presence of the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount presents a significant challenge for the rebuilding of the Jewish temple. Although several hypothetical scenarios have been suggested, including building an elevated temple above the dome or subterranean temple beneath it, the 2 prevailing scenarios are to build the temple somewhere on the Temple Mount but not where the dome is, or relocate the dome and build the temple on the dome spot. There has been a lot of speculation about where the temple should be built. There are experts on both sides of the aisle, whether it should be built in the current location of the dome or in a separate location on the Temple Mount. In a few minutes, I will explain why I believe it will be built on a separate location rather than on the location of the dome. For now, virtually everyone agrees that it will be on the Temple Mount somewhere. Now let's discuss how long it will take to build it. First, it's important to note that Israel has been making many preparations for the building of the third temple, including the creation of necessary tools, furniture, training of priests, and even the breeding of red heifers. This ongoing readiness highlights the strong motivation and anticipation among certain groups within Israel for the reconstruction of the temple. One of the primary sites you could visit on the internet is the Temple Institute. The Temple Institute is an organization dedicated to the reconstruction of the Third Temple and has been actively preparing for its rebuilding. They have created replicas of the sacred vessels, garments, and other items needed for temple worship according to biblical specifications. Items such as the menorah, which is the golden lampstand, the table of showbread, the incense altar, and the priestly garments have been meticulously recreated. These items are ready for use in the temple, demonstrating a high level of preparedness. Kohanim are priests from the tribe of Levi, and they have been trained in the rituals and procedures required for the temple service. This training includes the handling of sacrifices, the performance of ceremonial duties, and the observance of purity laws. The red heifer is essential for the purification rituals necessary to reestablish temple worship. Efforts have been made to breed red heifers in Israel that meet the biblical requirements, which include being without blemish and having no more than 2 non-red hairs. Detailed architectural plans for the Third Temple have been developed based on biblical descriptions and historical research. These plans include the layout and dimensions of the temple and its courtyards. Second, while there may not be large stockpiles of building materials such as stones and timber specifically earmarked for the Temple Institute and other groups have made preparations to source and acquire these materials quickly when the opportunity arises. That doesn't mean, however, that Israel won't be preparing and pre-storing some of these construction materials. The materials that will be needed will include limestone. The primary material used in the construction of the previous temples was limestone, specifically the type quarried from the hills surrounding Jerusalem. This would likely be used again to maintain historical and architectural consistency. Marble. For certain elements requiring more decorative stonework, marble could be used, especially for interior spaces. Israel has its own marble quarries, primarily located in the Negev desert. Cedar wood. Solomon's temple famously used cedar wood from Lebanon, known for its durability and pleasant scent. It would likely be used for the beams, panels, and various ornamental aspects. However, the cedar forests of Lebanon are now protected, and the harvesting of cedar trees is highly restricted due to conservation efforts. Obtaining cedar from Lebanon would require special permissions and agreements, possibly through international diplomacy. Alternatively, cedar can be sourced from other countries with significant cedar forests, such as Turkey or Cyprus. These countries could potentially supply the needed wood under commercial agreements. Cypress and pine. These woods might also be used as they were historically utilized for various structural components. Cypress trees grow in Israel, but not in large quantities suitable for major construction projects. However, Israel could import cypress wood from other Mediterranean countries, such as Greece or Italy, where cypress is more abundant. There will also be the need for precious metals. Gold was used for overlaying certain parts of the interior, such as the Holy of Holies and various temple utensils. Gold leaf and gold plating techniques would be employed to provide this. Silver was used for some of the temple's vessels and possibly for certain decorative elements. Bronze was used for items like the altar, the laver, which is the wash basin, and other functional elements. Although Israel itself is not a major producer of these materials, Israeli companies are involved in international mining operations, which could provide access to the necessary materials. Also, the global supply chain for these metals is well established, and considering Israel's strong, diversified economy, these materials would be relatively easy to procure. The Ark of the Covenant is not needed for the temple. After the siege of Babylon against Jerusalem, the Ark of the Covenant has never been found. When the Second Temple was built, there was no Ark of the Covenant in the Holy of Holies, not even when Jesus was on the earth. Instead, for 600 years, the blood was sprinkled on a foundation stone from the first temple that was placed in the Holy of Holies. And yet, the temple and sacrifices functioned normally. Third, assuming Israel has all of this in place and utilizes modern construction methods, equipment, and materials like concrete for foundations, steel for structural, glass for windows and skylights, as well as HVAC systems for environmental control, what would the likely timetable be? The exact time required to rebuild the temple is not explicitly stated in biblical prophecy or historical records, but several factors can provide a reasonable estimate. Historically, Solomon's temple, which was the first temple, took about 7 years. However, the methods, technology, and resources available at that time were far less advanced than they are today. Herod's temple, which was the second temple, had the main temple structure which allowed for worship and sacrifices and was completed in about 1.5 years, although work on the additional buildings continued for many years after that. Today, since detailed architectural plans are already in place, the project could move forward quickly once construction was authorized. Based on the historical context of the first and second temples, the use of modern construction equipment and techniques, such as prefabrication and modular construction, and the extensive preparatory work that has already been done, it is feasible to estimate the third temple could be built within 24 to 33 months. This timeline would be well within the 42 months from the signing of the peace covenant to the breaking of the covenant by the Antichrist at the midpoint of the tribulation. Furthermore, it should be noted that it is possible that sacrifices could begin before the completion of the third temple. Historically, the practice of offering sacrifices has not always been strictly confined to the existence of a fully completed temple. For example, before the construction of the first temple, the Israelites used the tabernacle, a portable sanctuary, for sacrifices. This shows that sacrifices can be conducted in a designated holy area even if a permanent temple structure is not yet in place. Also, when the Jews returned from Babylonian exile, according to Ezra chapter 3, verse 6, they began offering sacrifices on a rebuilt altar before the foundations of the second temple were even laid. For this third temple, one of the key elements required for sacrifices is the altar. The Temple Institute has already constructed a stone altar which meets biblical specifications. This altar could be set up and used for sacrifices independently of the temple's full completion. In addition, priests have been trained and are prepared to conduct the sacrifices according to Levitical law. This means that the personnel and the knowledge necessary for performing sacrifices are ready to be deployed as soon as the conditions permit. For sacrifices to begin, there would need to be a consensus or approval from the relevant religious authorities. Once this approval is obtained, sacrifices could commence on a temporary altar or at least a designated site on the Temple Mount. Now let's look at when the temple will be built. To understand the timing, we need to look at the world geopolitical conditions at the time the temple will be rebuilt, who will likely have control of the Temple Mount at that time, and how the peace covenant with the Antichrist comes into play. As we learned from our previous lesson, the Bible predicts the world will be experiencing a time of global peace. Accordingly, Israel might perceive itself as being safe and secure, particularly in a scenario where there is a relaxation of religious tolerance and efforts to create peace and harmony in the Middle East. In addition, as we discussed in Lesson 5, after God's miraculous protection of Israel from the Russian Allied invasion, there could be key international alliances in place with Israel to further contribute to a sense of divine protection and security. Nevertheless, the control of the Temple Mount will still likely be a complex and sensitive issue involving both Israel and Jordanian authorities, not unlike it is today. Currently, after the Six-Day War in 1967, when Israel captured East Jerusalem, including the Old City and the Temple Mount from Jordan, Israel has maintained overall security over the entire city, including the Temple Mount. However, despite Israel's overall sovereignty, the day-to-day administration of the Temple Mount is overseen by the Islamic Waqf. a Jordanian religious trust. This arrangement was established to maintain the status quo and ensure the Muslim religious practices and access to the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock are preserved. Consequently, although Israel controls security around the Temple Mount, including access points and security checks, the Waqf manages the internal administration and religious activities. Thus, non-Muslim access to the Temple Mount is limited and regulated by Israel's security to maintain peace, and non-Muslim worship is generally prohibited on the Temple Mount. The Temple Mount is one of the most contested religious sites in the world, with significant sensitivities for both Jews and Muslims. Any changes to the current conditions, including any attempt by Israel to take control of all or part of the Temple Mount for the construction of the Third Temple, would likely lead to significant tension and severe regional and global conflict. The one world government will undoubtedly endeavor to do all it can to maintain the status quo to prevent such an occurrence. However, Israel has historically demonstrated a propensity to defy international expectations. Consider the Six-Day War of 1967, which exemplifies Israel's willingness to take bold, unilateral actions to secure its strategic interests despite international opposition. In a similar manner, Israel might assume unlawful access to the Temple Mount and begin staging for the building of the Third Temple, disregarding existing agreements, international norms, and even the oversight of the one world government. A provocative move like this would certainly ignite a firestorm of anger among the international community, leading to a severe geopolitical emergency. Israel's actions would provoke a strong response by the one world government to quickly put an end to the crisis, thus setting the stage for a charismatic figure like the Antichrist to negotiate a strong and binding peace covenant with Israel and the many surrounding nations with interest in the site. To do this, the Antichrist leverages his charisma and persuasive skills to bring the angry nations to the negotiating table. He presents himself as a peacemaker, probably offering attractive incentives such as economic aid, security guarantees, and promises of international cooperation. Daniel chapter 9 verse 27 describes it like this: "And he," that is the Antichrist, "shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week, meaning 7 years, and for half of the week he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering." That is when the Antichrist breaks the covenant after 3.5 years. The word strong comes from the Hebrew term gabar, which implies a covenant that is prevailing, forceful, or binding. This suggests that the agreement is exceptionally firm and backed by considerable authority. The word many indicates that the covenant involves multiple parties, likely a broad coalition of nations or groups with interests in the region. Utilizing a mix of deceit and charm, the Antichrist successfully negotiates a strong and binding covenant between Israel and the many nations. This agreement is designed to bring immediate peace to the region, addressing the concerns of all parties involved. The covenant, once signed, allows Israel to proceed with the construction of the Third Temple on the Temple Mount under specific conditions that ensure the site's security and respects the interests of other religions and political stakeholders. Although still conjecture, this scenario aligns with Israel's historical behavior of taking bold actions despite international opposition, and plausibly explains the necessity of an urgent and strong peace treaty due to the geopolitical and religious tensions that would arise from initiating unlawful staging for the temple construction on the Temple Mount. It also clarifies why Israel would be motivated to sign such a peace treaty if it allows for them to resume construction on the temple. Furthermore, it provides a realistic context for the Antichrist to emerge as a global leader, gaining international acclaim for his role in brokering peace. While other scenarios are viable, in my opinion, this scenario stands out due to its coherence with historical patterns and prophetic interpretations. It provides a clear pathway to the fulfillment of these prophecies and aligns well with both current geopolitical realities and biblical prophecies. Considering all the above, we can now speculate on why the temple will probably not be built on the site of the Dome of the Rock. First, it is noteworthy that the tenor of Daniel 9, verse 27, suggests a sense of urgency to the negotiations, requiring direct intervention by the Antichrist to resolve implied conflict or stress in the region. On the other hand, negotiations to relocate the dome or build a new dome while maintaining peace would take considerably more time, and the motivations for signing such an agreement would be less forceful, suggesting an uncharacteristic willingness on Israel's part to be patient and much less need for the Antichrist's skills to bring such a covenant to quick execution. Second, there is simply not enough time to relocate or build the dome in a different location and still build the temple within the 42 months of the tribulation that spans the signing of the peace covenant to the breaking of the peace covenant. So, if part of the negotiations would include site selection for the new dome and architectural and engineering drawings, and assuming no construction would begin until the peace covenant was executed, a likely timeline would be dome site preparation 3 to 6 months, dome construction 18 to 24 months, temple site preparation 3 to 6 months, temple construction 18 to 24 months, temple prep for sacrifices 3 months. The total time would be 46 to 63 months, which is 3 3/4 to 5 1/4 years. The likelihood that the Dome of the Rock could be relocated, the existing site prepared, and the third temple built to have it fully operational for some reasonable time within the first 3.5 years of the tribulation is extremely low. On the other hand, as stated earlier, if the temple was built on a separate location on the Temple Mount from the Dome of the Rock, it could be built and operational within 24 to 33 months. We don't know exactly where the temple will be built on the Temple Mount, but we can be reasonably sure it won't be built on the site of the Dome of the Rock. One last note of observation about this third temple. Some, including myself, believe that according to passages like Isaiah 66, verses 1 to 6, John 4, verses 21 to 24, Acts 7, verses 48 to 50, 1 Corinthians 3, verses 16 to 17, and others, the third temple, which is generally referred to as the tribulation temple, will not be occupied by God. Since the end of Jesus' ministry, the true worship of God is not through the sacrifices of bulls and goats, nor adherence to the rules or regulations of ceremonial laws. The true worship of God comes from a contrite heart that by God's grace has been born again through faith alone in the finished work of Christ on the cross. Although the Jews will build this temple, God and His glory will not be the occupants.